Have you ever had a dream that felt too real? So vivid, so intense, that when you woke up, you couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a dream? My name is Elias Thorne, and I'm an archivist, a job that has me buried in the forgotten texts and lost secrets of history. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare I'm about to share. This isn't just a story. This is something that has haunted me for years. And the worst part? I'm not sure if it was ever just a dream, or if something far darker has been following me ever since. I know, you're probably thinking, it's just a dream, right? That's what I thought too. Until the things I saw in my nightmares began to appear in my waking life. It started small, a shadow flickering in the corner of my vision, whispers I couldn't quite make out, but that seemed to follow me from room to room. Then, it escalated. Objects in my home began to move. Doors I had locked would be found wide open. And always, that same haunting presence from my dream lurking just out of sight, watching me. Before I go any further, do me a favor, subscribe to this channel and leave a like if you've ever experienced something that made you question reality. Trust me, you're going to want to stay with me through this, because the story only gets darker from here. Let me take you back to where it all began. I was in a deep sleep when the dream started. Or was it a dream? It felt too real. I was standing in front of an ancient, decaying mansion. The kind you only see in nightmares. The windows were shattered, the walls covered in creeping ivy, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. But there was something else, something far more disturbing. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. The mansion stood before me like a gaping maw, waiting to swallow me whole. And as I took that first step toward it, the ground beneath me shifted, like walking on graves that had long been forgotten. I can still feel the cold grip of fear that wrapped around me as I crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with dust and an overwhelming sense of dread. There was no light, except for the faintest glow coming from deeper within the mansion, beckoning me to come closer. I should have turned back. But something, curiosity, fear, or maybe some darker force, drew me in. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and as the door slammed shut behind me, I knew deep down that I had just walked into something I couldn't escape. It all started on what seemed like an ordinary night. I fell asleep as I always did, but this time, I was pulled into a dream so vivid that I could feel the cold air biting at my skin. In the dream, I found myself standing in front of a massive, decaying mansion. Its walls were dark, almost black, covered in thick vines that twisted and clung to the stone like skeletal hands. The windows were shattered, the glass long gone, and through the empty frames, I could see nothing but darkness. A strange, oppressive atmosphere surrounded the mansion, as if it had been abandoned by time itself. But there was something about it, something unsettlingly familiar, as though I had seen this place before. As I stepped closer, a thick, pungent smell of damp earth and decaying wood filled my lungs, making it hard to breathe. The scent was so strong, so real, that I could almost taste it on the back of my throat. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as I approached the entrance. The ground beneath me felt soft, almost like sinking into wet soil. Each step made a sickening squelch, as if the earth was alive and trying to pull me under. Then I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like the groan of an old door being forced open by the wind. Except there was no wind. The air was still, unnervingly silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves somewhere in the distance. But even that seemed out of place, like a whisper that shouldn't exist. As I entered the mansion, a wave of déjà vu crashed over me. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that flickered in the dim light felt oddly familiar. I had never been here before, not in waking life. Yet something deep inside told me that I had walked these halls once, long ago, or perhaps in another life. The further I ventured inside, the stronger this feeling grew, like a memory trapped in the back of my mind, just out of reach. The smell of old rotting wood intensified, mixing with the unmistakable stench of mold that clung to the walls like a sickness. I could hear the faint, distant sound of something dripping, slow, steady, like water leaking from an unseen crack, but in this house, it could have been anything. Then came the sound that stopped me cold in my tracks, a low rhythmic thumping. It was coming from somewhere deep within the mansion, growing louder, closer, with each passing second. My skin prickled, and a cold sweat began to form on the back of my neck. I strained to listen, and that's when I realized, it wasn't just a sound. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing somewhere beyond the darkness, just out of sight. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat, as a wave of terror washed over me. The sound of those footsteps was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, too heavy, too deliberate, like something far too large to be human. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, the air around me turning icy. My breath formed clouds in front of me, and that's when I saw it, the shadow. It flickered at the edge of my vision, moving along the walls, always just beyond where I could see it clearly. But I knew it was watching me. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming, like cold fingers trailing up my spine. I turned, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but the shadow moved faster, always slipping away, just out of reach. I wanted to leave to run, but something about the mansion held me there, an invisible force that I couldn't explain, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. As I took another hesitant step forward, my foot brushed against something soft. I looked down and saw that the ground was no longer wood, but covered in a strange, thick carpet. Except, it wasn't a carpet. It felt rough and uneven, and when I knelt down to touch it, my fingers sank into the soft, spongy surface. It was dirt. Wet, cold dirt, as if the mansion floor had been replaced with the earth from a graveyard. And then I saw them, faint, barely visible impressions in the dirt, as though someone, or something, had been dragged across the floor. The imprints led deeper into the mansion, disappearing into the darkness ahead. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run. But something, some morbid curiosity or perhaps a darker force, compelled me to keep going. I followed the trail, each step heavier than the last, the air thickening around me. The thumping sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until I reached a door, slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling from the cracks. The glow was weak, flickering like a dying flame, but it called to me, beckoning me to open the door and see what lay beyond. And so, with a trembling hand, I pushed it open, not knowing that what awaited me on the other side would change everything. As I pushed the door open, the creaking echoed through the empty hallway like a tortured scream. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle that sat on a small wooden table in the center. The flame barely illuminated the space, casting long twisted shadows on the walls that seemed to move on their own, writhing and shifting like they were alive. The air inside the room was thick, oppressive, as if it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest, every nerve in my body screaming that I shouldn't be there, that I was walking into something I wasn't meant to see. At first glance, the room seemed empty, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to notice things out of place. The walls were lined with old, decaying bookshelves, the wood rotting and splintering with age. Strange objects sat on the shelves, antique clocks that had long since stopped ticking, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, and what looked like jars filled with murky liquid, the contents of which I didn't dare to imagine. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. It was so thick, so complete, that it felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. They were louder now, closer, and I realized with growing dread that they were coming from somewhere just beyond the walls, pacing back and forth as if whatever was making them was trying to decide whether to reveal itself. The sound made my skin crawl, each step reverberating in my bones like a death knell. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was there, lurking in the shadows, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement, and that's when I saw it, just barely visible in the flickering candlelight, a figure standing in the far corner. It was tall, its form shrouded in darkness, and for a moment, I thought it was just another shadow cast by the candle. But then it moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it shifted closer, and as it did, the temperature in the room dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air, small puffs of white mist, and the cold wrapped around me like icy fingers. My eyes locked onto the figure, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it had no face, just a blank, featureless void where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. A wave of nausea swept over me, and I took a step back, nearly knocking over the candle. My heart pounded in my ears, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. I couldn't look away from it, couldn't tear my eyes from that awful, empty face. It stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting for me to make the first move. And then, as if the house itself had come alive, the objects in the room began to change. The books on the shelves shifted slightly, their pages rustling though there was no breeze. The doll's eyes, which had been lifeless and glassy just moments before, now seemed to follow my every movement, their heads tilting ever so slightly as I backed away. The clocks on the shelves began to tick once more, slowly at first, then faster, the sound growing louder and more frantic until it became an unbearable cacophony. The whole room was coming to life, in ways that defied all logic and reason. Desperate to escape, I turned toward the door, but before I could reach it, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, so close that it sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, fear rooting me in place. The air was heavy with the sensation of being watched, not just by the faceless figure, but by something far more ancient and malevolent. Every shadow in the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though the house itself was alive, feeding on my fear. I could feel its presence, closing in on me, wrapping around me like a shroud, suffocating me. As I stood there, paralyzed, I heard a low whisper, so faint that at first, I thought I had imagined it. But it was real. The voice was soft, insidious, like a secret being spoken just behind my ear. It called my name, Elias. The sound of it made my blood run cold, as if it knew me, as if it had been waiting for me all along. My pulse raced, and my mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but my body refused to obey. The figure in the corner took another step forward, and with it, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just calling my name anymore, they were telling me to stay, to listen, to belong. I finally broke free of my paralysis, stumbling backward toward the door. My hand fumbled for the handle, slick with sweat, and I yanked it open, throwing myself out into the hallway. The footsteps followed, echoing behind me as I ran, and I could still hear the whispers, growing fainter but no less terrifying. I didn't stop until I was outside the mansion, the cold night air hitting me like a punch to the chest. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart racing, and as I looked back at the mansion, its windows dark and empty, I knew one thing for certain: whatever had happened inside that house wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment I stepped out of that cursed room, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. But I wasn't safe, not yet. As I stood in the dark hallway, the walls seemed to close in, suffocating me with their oppressive weight. The air was thick, almost syrupy, making every breath feel like I was inhaling something more than air, something ancient, something sinister. My legs trembled as I tried to regain my composure, but the atmosphere was too heavy, as if the house itself was alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. And then I heard it, the door behind me creaking open, slow and deliberate, as though something was about to emerge from the darkness. I didn't dare turn around. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were frozen to the ground, glued by an unseen force. It felt as if invisible hands had wrapped themselves around my ankles, anchoring me to that spot. My heart raced in my chest, pounding so hard that it drowned out all other sounds. Then, without warning, the oppressive silence shattered. The whispering began again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices echoing off the crumbling walls. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, ancient, guttural, and filled with malice. But amidst the unintelligible murmurs, I heard one word clear as day: stay. Before I could react, the light in the hallway flickered and then vanished entirely, plunging me into total darkness. Panic set in. I reached out, my hand searching for something, anything, to ground me, but there was nothing but cold, damp air. That's when I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck, icy and unnatural. My skin crawled as the presence I had sensed earlier was now right behind me, close enough that I could feel the cold emanating from its body, or lack thereof. I forced myself to turn around, and what I saw chilled me to my core. Standing in the doorway was the figure from my nightmares, the one I had hoped was just a figment of my imagination. But now, face to face, I realized it was all too real. Its hollow eyes, or rather, the empty void where eyes should have been, stared back at me. The darkness that filled those empty sockets was so deep, so impenetrable, that it seemed to swallow the very light around it. Its body was tall, unnaturally elongated, its limbs too thin, too stretched, as if it had been twisted and warped by some unspeakable force. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It just was, a terrible, silent sentinel watching me with that impossible, faceless stare. I tried to scream, but my voice refused to obey, trapped in my throat by the overwhelming terror. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and with each movement, the floorboards beneath it groaned as if in agony. My legs finally unlocked, and I stumbled backward, my back slamming into the cold, damp wall. The figure didn't stop. It continued its slow, menacing approach, closing the distance between us inch by inch, until it stood mere feet away. The shadows around it writhed like living creatures, drawn to its presence, as if it were the very source of the darkness itself. Desperation gripped me. I turned and bolted down the hallway, not caring where I was headed as long as it was away from that thing. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the narrow corridor, the sound distorted, almost as if the walls were swallowing the noise. Behind me, I could hear the steady, unhurried footsteps of the figure, following me with the same calm, deliberate pace. No matter how fast I ran, it was always just behind me, like a predator toying with its prey, savoring the chase. I reached the end of the hallway and burst into another room. This one was larger, but no less disturbing. In the center stood an altar of sorts, and on it, an object that made my blood run cold, a large ornate mirror. Its surface was covered in dust, but beneath that layer of grime, I could see faint reflections moving, though the room itself was still. As I approached, drawn inexplicably to it, the whispers began again, louder, more insistent. The voices in my head were now screaming, a chaotic cacophony that made it hard to think, to breathe. My reflection in the mirror was distorted, twisted, just like the figure that had been chasing me. But as I stared into the glass, something shifted. The figure from the hallway was no longer behind me. It was in the mirror, standing just over my shoulder. Its hollow, eyeless face loomed closer and closer, until it seemed to press against the glass, as if trying to break through. I tried to step back, but my body was paralyzed, frozen in place by a terror so intense it felt like my very soul was being crushed under its weight. And then, the mirror cracked. A single jagged line snaked across its surface, splitting my reflection in two. At that moment, the figure's hand reached through the crack, impossibly real, its cold, bony fingers brushing against my skin. I jerked back, breaking free of the trance, and stumbled to the ground, gasping for air. The mirror shattered, pieces of glass raining down around me like shards of a broken nightmare. But when I looked up, the figure was gone. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The room was silent again, the whispers gone, but the oppressive weight of the house remained. I looked around, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. Just the cold, empty room and the shattered remains of the mirror. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. But deep down, I knew the truth. The figure wasn't gone. It had simply moved closer, hiding in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The nightmare had only just begun. The days following that nightmare were a blur, but the terror lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, the hollow eyes, the twisted form, the cold, suffocating presence. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by stress or exhaustion. But then, things started to happen. Strange, inexplicable things that made it impossible to believe this was all in my head. It started with small details, things that could easily be dismissed as coincidences. Objects in my home would be out of place, books moved from shelves, doors that I knew I had locked found wide open in the morning. But the worst part was the mirror. Every time I looked into it, I could feel something watching me from the other side, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. And then one morning, the first crack appeared. A thin, jagged line snaked across the glass, just like in the nightmare. My reflection was distorted, almost unrecognizable, and I could swear I saw a shadow move behind me in the reflection, though when I turned around, the room was empty. That's when I knew I had to find answers. The dream had felt too real, too vivid to be just a figment of my imagination. I needed to know more about the mansion, about the figure, about the symbol I had seen in the room. I began searching online, diving into obscure forums and old records, hoping to find anything that could explain what I had experienced. And that's when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. I found an old article, buried deep in the archives of a forgotten newspaper, about a mansion that matched the one from my dream. The article was dated nearly a century ago and spoke of strange occurrences, disappearances, and a legend that surrounded the estate. According to the report, the mansion had once belonged to an eccentric collector of arcane artifacts, a man obsessed with the occult, who was rumored to have conducted dark rituals in the dead of night. His obsession had driven him mad, and after his mysterious disappearance, the house had been abandoned. Locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had been lost to its darkness. But the most disturbing part was a mention of the figure. The article described sightings of a tall, faceless shadow, one that seemed to stalk anyone who ventured too close to the mansion. People had reported hearing whispers, seeing strange symbols carved into the walls, and experiencing vivid nightmares that seemed to blur the line between dream and reality. The symbol from my dream, the one I had seen in the mirror, was mentioned in the article. It was said to be the mark of an ancient entity, one that could bind itself to a person through their dreams, pulling them deeper into its influence with every encounter. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the article. It was as if the nightmare had followed me into the waking world, its claws sinking deeper into my reality with each passing day. I couldn't escape the feeling that the mansion wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was waiting for me. Desperate for more information, I dug deeper, finding other articles and reports, each more unsettling than the last. There were stories of people who had gone missing after visiting the mansion, their last known whereabouts always near the estate. Some had returned, but they were never the same. They spoke of being watched, of feeling something cold and malevolent lurking in the corners of their lives, just out of sight. And then there were the dreams just like mine, filled with the same dark figure, the same suffocating presence, the same haunting whispers. The more I learned, the more the lines between dream and reality began to blur. I started seeing the symbol everywhere, carved into trees, etched into the dirt, even scrawled in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the more I saw it, the more I began to realize that it wasn't just a coincidence. Something was following me, something that had come from that mansion and attached itself to me through the dream. It was real, and it was growing stronger. One night, I woke to find the symbol etched into the wall above my bed, glowing faintly in the darkness. I ran my fingers over it, expecting to feel the cold plaster beneath my fingertips, but instead, I felt a strange, almost pulsating warmth. It was as if the symbol was alive, as if it had been burned into the wall by some unseen hand. I scrubbed at it, but it wouldn't fade. No matter how hard I tried, the symbol remained, a constant reminder of the nightmare that had become my reality. Driven by fear and desperation, I began reaching out to locals who might know more about the mansion's history. Most refused to speak about it, their faces going pale at the mention of its name. But one person agreed to meet me, a woman who had lived near the mansion her entire life. When I showed her the symbol, she went white as a sheet. She told me that the figure in my dreams was no ordinary ghost, but something far older, something that fed on fear and despair, drawing its victims deeper into its realm with every encounter. She warned me that once it had marked me, there was no escape. Her words echoed in my mind as I left her house, the weight of her warning pressing down on me like a heavy cloak. I knew then that I couldn't outrun it. Whatever had been awakened in that mansion was coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The dream wasn't just a dream, it was a doorway, and I had already stepped through. The need for answers consumed me, pulling me back to the one place I swore I'd never return to, the mansion. I had to see it for myself, to confront the horrors lurking within those decaying walls. There was no escaping it anymore. The figure, the symbol, the dreams, they were all tied to that cursed place. So one cold, fog-choked morning, I set out for the mansion, my heart pounding with dread and anticipation. As I approached the grounds, the air grew colder, denser, as if the mansion itself was exhaling a breath of death into the surrounding landscape. When the mansion finally came into view, a suffocating fear wrapped around me like a noose tightening with every step. The building loomed in the distance, its shadowy outline barely visible through the mist. The ivy that had once crawled along the walls now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, twisting and writhing like serpents. The windows were dark and empty, as though the house were a hollow shell, waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter. But I had no choice. The pull was too strong. The moment I crossed the threshold, it felt as though the air inside the mansion had a weight to it, a suffocating presence that clung to my skin like cold sweat. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I wandered the halls, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the house itself were trying to drag me down. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, darting away the moment I turned to look. But I could feel them watching me, whispering just out of earshot, filling the air with their sinister presence. As I explored the mansion, I felt something change within me. The fear I had carried for days, that constant gnawing terror, was giving way to something darker, an unrelenting obsession to uncover the truth. I had to understand what this entity was, why it had marked me, and more importantly, how I could escape it. My search led me to a small dusty study tucked away behind a set of decaying doors. The room was lined with shelves filled with ancient, rotting books, their pages yellowed with age. A heavy, foreboding feeling settled over me as I scanned the titles. Every book seemed to be about the occult, the dark arts, and forbidden rituals, practices meant to summon and bind forces far beyond human comprehension. That's when I found the journal. It was hidden behind a row of old tomes, its leather cover cracked and worn, the pages inside yellowed and fragile. My hands shook as I opened it, the musty smell of decay filling my nostrils. The journal belonged to the mansion's original owner, the collector of arcane artifacts I had read about. He had chronicled his descent into madness, detailing the rituals he performed in an attempt to summon a being from beyond the veil of reality. The more I read, the more I realized that the figure from my dreams was no mere specter. It was the very entity he had summoned, an ancient force that had been trapped within the mansion's walls for centuries, feeding on the souls of those who dared to trespass. The journal's final entries were filled with desperate, incoherent ramblings. The collector had become obsessed with the figure, believing it held the key to immortality. He wrote of dreams that mirrored my own, of the symbol that had appeared in his life, just as it had in mine. His final words were a warning, scrawled hastily across the page. The entity cannot be banished. It can only be passed on. My blood ran cold as I realized the meaning behind his words. The entity wasn't merely haunting me, it was trying to claim me, to use me as a vessel to escape its prison. As I stood there, the air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on me from all sides. My vision blurred, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and twist, forming shapes that moved toward me with deliberate predatory intent. I stumbled backward, clutching the journal to my chest as the walls seemed to close in. Panic set in as I realized I wasn't alone in the room. A presence had manifested, its cold breath brushing against the back of my neck. I could feel its eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, boring into me, hungry and expectant. In that moment of pure terror, I heard a sound, footsteps. But these were different, heavier, more deliberate. I turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows. Margot, the woman who had warned me about the mansion. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else, something darker in her expression. She approached slowly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her words laced with panic. "It's too late now. It's chosen you." I tried to ask her what she meant, but before I could, the shadows surged forward, engulfing the room in darkness. The entity had revealed itself fully now, a towering figure of darkness with eyes like bottomless voids. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in an instant. Margot screamed, her voice cut short as the figure passed through her, leaving her crumpled on the floor like a lifeless doll. I could only watch, paralyzed by fear, as the entity turned its gaze toward me, its eyeless face somehow filled with an unspeakable hunger. Desperation took hold of me. I ran, crashing through the door and into the hallway, but no matter how fast I moved, the entity was always right behind me, its presence looming like a shadow that I could never outrun. My vision blurred, the house around me twisting and warping, as though reality itself was bending to the entity's will. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, its whispers filling my ears, telling me that there was no escape. I was trapped in its world now, a pawn in its ancient, twisted game. As I stumbled through the darkened hallways, I knew there was no turning back. The entity had marked me, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed me. The mansion was alive with its presence, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the shadows, reminding me that I was no longer in control. I was a prisoner of this ancient, malevolent force, and the only way out was through the dark path it had laid before me. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that this journey had only just begun, and that the worst was yet to come. I could feel the house closing in on me as I fled down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the warped, rotting wood. The walls seemed to breathe, the very structure of the mansion pulsating as if alive, feeding off my fear. The air grew thicker, darker, each breath becoming harder to take, and the shadows danced with malevolent intent. I could sense it behind me. Its presence was a constant, suffocating weight. No matter how fast I ran, I could feel the entity closing the distance, its cold, hollow gaze searing into the back of my skull. I turned corner after corner, desperately trying to escape the nightmare that had become my reality. Then I saw it, a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out from the cracks. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled toward it, hope flaring up inside me for the briefest of moments. But as I drew closer, the whispering started again, low, guttural, and insidious. The words were unintelligible, but their meaning was clear. They were pulling me in, drawing me toward the room like a moth to a flame, and I realized too late that I was walking straight into a trap. Yet, there was no other option. The mansion had become a labyrinth, and this door felt like the only way out, or at least, the next step in the nightmare. I pushed the door open, and what lay inside chilled me to the bone. In the center of the room was an altar, ancient and weathered, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the floor, symbols that matched the one I had seen in my dream, in the journal, and etched into my reality. Above the altar, suspended by invisible forces, was a mirror. Not just any mirror, it was the same one from my dream, the same one that had cracked when the entity first revealed itself. The glass was now shattered, fragments hanging in the air, frozen in time. They glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that bathed the room in a sickly glow. As I stepped closer, I noticed something else, a diary, resting on the altar, its pages open as if waiting for me. The leather binding was worn, ancient, but the pages were filled with fresh ink, words written in a hand that looked disturbingly familiar. I approached with caution, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched, and peered at the pages. To my horror, the diary was chronicling my life. Every event, every nightmare, every moment leading up to this point was written in meticulous detail, as if I had been living out a story already written. But the worst part was the final entry, my name, followed by the date and time of now. The ink was still wet. Suddenly, the room darkened, the faint light from the shards of the mirror dimming until it was almost completely black. The temperature plummeted, my breath turning to mist in the freezing air. I could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps behind me, and this time, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The entity had arrived. I turned slowly, dread filling every inch of my body, and there it was, the figure from my dreams, from the mirror, from the depths of the mansion's cursed history. It stood before me, its eyeless face staring directly at me, its form towering and twisted, like a shadow that had escaped the boundaries of reality. The entity didn't move. It simply watched, its presence more powerful, more overwhelming than ever before. The air around it warped, bending light and space, as though the very fabric of the room was distorting under its influence. Then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. Not in words, but in thoughts, directly into my mind. The time has come. The phrase repeated, echoing inside my skull, each word hammering into my consciousness like nails being driven into a coffin. Panic surged through me, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear and the weight of inevitability. I tried to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The entity extended a hand, long skeletal fingers reaching toward me, and I felt the cold grip of death wrapping around my soul. It wasn't just after my life, it wanted something more. My essence, my very being, was what it craved. The closer it got, the more I could feel it pulling me, draining me, as if I were being drawn into an endless void from which there was no return. Just when I thought all was lost, my eyes caught sight of something on the altar, an old, weathered book, different from the diary. Its cover was marked with the same symbol that had haunted my nightmares, and instinctively, I knew it held the key to ending this. With every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged for the book, my fingers barely brushing against its cover as the entity's hand reached for me. The moment I touched it, a surge of energy shot through me, and the room exploded with light. The mirror shards, suspended in mid-air, began to spin wildly, reflecting the light in all directions. The entity recoiled, its form distorting, flickering like a dying flame. The whispers in my mind turned to screams, screams of rage, of desperation, as if the entity knew its time was running out. The light from the mirror grew brighter, more intense, until the entire room was engulfed in blinding radiance. I could feel the entity's hold on me weakening, its presence slipping away, dragged back into whatever hell it had come from. But just as quickly as the light had come, it vanished, leaving me in complete darkness. The silence was deafening, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The entity was gone, but the air still felt heavy, charged with the residue of something ancient, something dark. As I pulled myself to my feet, I noticed the book still in my hands. Its pages were blank now, the symbols and writing gone, as if it had served its purpose. I glanced at the altar, at the shattered mirror, and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of relief. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The entity had been banished for now, but I could still feel it, watching, waiting. It wasn't gone. Not entirely. I left the mansion that night, but its mark stayed with me. The symbol still appeared in the corners of my vision, in the reflections of mirrors, in the dark spaces where shadows lingered. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers. They call to me, just as they did before, pulling me back toward the nightmare I can never truly escape. The nightmare may have ended, but the terror had only just begun. I wish I could say that walking out of the mansion that night brought me peace. I wish I could tell you that whatever haunted that place was gone forever. But the truth is far more unsettling. The moment I stepped outside, something was different. The world didn't feel the same. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if the atmosphere itself was saturated with a malevolence I had barely escaped. The sky above me, dark and starless, loomed like a suffocating void. The whispers had stopped, the presence of the entity was no longer pressing against my mind, but deep down, I knew it was far from over. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. I had expected the nightmares to come back immediately, to be plunged back into the madness, but instead there was silence. An eerie, hollow silence that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. It felt wrong, as if the calm was just a thin veil hiding something far worse. The symbol I had seen so many times, the one that had haunted my dreams and appeared everywhere, was gone. But the absence of it didn't bring relief. It filled me with dread. It was as if the entity had retreated, not out of defeat, but out of patience, waiting for the right moment to strike again. A week passed, and for a brief moment, I began to think I had escaped. But then, strange things started happening. The mirror in my bathroom, the one that had always been ordinary, now seemed to ripple, the reflection subtly distorted, as if something was lurking just beyond the glass. At first, I told myself it was my imagination. After all, I had been through hell, and my mind was still reeling. But the signs were everywhere. Lights flickering at odd hours. Doors creaking open without explanation. Shadows that seemed to stretch too far, bend in unnatural ways, like they had a life of their own. The first time I saw the symbol again, I was brushing my teeth. I looked up, and there it was, etched into the fog on the bathroom mirror, as clear as day. My heart stopped, a cold wave of terror washing over me. I wiped the mirror clean, but no matter how much I scrubbed, the faint outline of the symbol remained, like a scar that refused to heal. It was the same symbol that had marked the walls of the mansion, the same one I had seen in the book, and now it was in my home, following me, watching me. It wasn't long before the dreams returned. They were different now, less vivid, more fragmented, but just as terrifying. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the memory of the entity's hollow gaze burned into my mind. Each dream was the same. I was back in the mansion, walking through the endless corridors, searching for something I couldn't name, knowing that the entity was always just behind me, waiting for me to slip, to make one wrong move. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just in my dreams anymore, it had seeped into my waking life. I could feel its presence everywhere I went, a constant, suffocating weight on my shoulders. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong, reflections in windows that shouldn't have been there. I couldn't escape it, no matter how far I ran. The entity was with me, inside me, and it wasn't letting go. And then one night, the whispers came back. Faint at first, barely audible, like the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. But soon, they grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with their cryptic, maddening words. I tried to block them out, tried to drown them with music, with anything that would keep my mind occupied, but nothing worked. They followed me everywhere, into the streets, into my work, even into my most mundane moments. It was as if the entity was reminding me that I belonged to it now, that no matter how far I ran, I would never truly be free. The final straw came when I woke up one morning to find the symbol carved into my skin, deep, angry lines that burned with a cold fire. I stared at it in horror, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no rational explanation. The entity had marked me, claimed me, and now it was inside me, a part of me that I couldn't escape. I tried to hide it, to cover the mark with bandages, but it was useless. The pain was constant, a dull, throbbing reminder that the nightmare was far from over. Now I sit here writing this, knowing that the entity is watching me even as I speak. I can feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for the moment to pull me back into the darkness. I don't know how much time I have left before it takes me, before I become another victim of the mansion's curse. But there's one thing I do know, this isn't over. Not for me, and not for anyone who dares to come too close. The mansion may be empty now, but the entity is still there waiting. And it's hungry. So, I ask you this, do you believe in nightmares? Do you believe that some dreams can reach out and pull you into their twisted reality, never to let go? Because I didn't. Not until now. And if you're still watching, if you've made it this far, I need you to understand one thing. The nightmare doesn't end when you wake up. It's just beginning. If you've ever had a dream you couldn't shake, if you've ever felt like something was watching you in the dark, let me know in the comments. Share your story. And please, whatever you do, Stay away from the mansion. Don't make the same mistake I did. Because once it has you in its sights, it never lets go. So, do me one last favor. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this story. Maybe someone out there can figure out how to break the curse. Maybe someone can find a way out. But for now I'm stuck, and the whispers are getting louder. The nightmare is calling. And it's only a matter of time before it claims me.